Hi everyone, welcome to my review of Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989. So yes, once again back another Spielberg review, and this time rounding off this legendary trilogy, Indiana Jones. You know, I do consider this a trilogy, and of course the final in the trilogy is the Last Crusade, and yes, a very special film, and one of Spielberg's more popular films at times. Other times, of course, people, do hate on this film a little bit. The only one that's kind of untouchable, as we say, is Raiders. But yes, this film, of course, 89, rounding off, kind of his 80s work, which for me, is the best decade, for Spielberg, and really, as I've said before, pretty much, any director within a single decade, I think, is this for Spielberg. It's just the heights really of cinema, overall from one director across a whole decade. The amount of masterpieces here, and of course this whole trilogy for me is one of my very favourites. And I have of course been reviewing, the other two in the trilogy, and quite a few Spielbergs recently. More to come of course, and eventually the entire catalogue. Spielberg's work this year. This film, as I say, kind of controversial, but of course, overall more popular than Temple of Doom. A return to the more kind of, you could say, Temple of Doom is a weird one because it is considered the darkest of the three. But again, it's more kind of targeted, as you would say, towards children more. Although that doesn't really matter at all. It's the fact that it is kind of targeted more for kids, but it is at the same time more darker. And these ones, there's some Raiders, in particular ways in their tone, more light, more kind of just adventurous in their spirit, and as well, just just more kind of humour and stuff. But yes, this film is a return, I think, to Raiders. The quality, of course, Temple of Doom. While I do think personally, and controversially, that it's a masterpiece. Last Crusade, this is a step up once again, and back to the level really for me of Raiders. It's not. As I've said in my Raiders review, that is my favourite of the trilogy, and my favourite action film of all time. This is the accolade I give it. But this film for me, The Last Crusade, is literally a heavenly film. It's a dream come true. This is, the closest for me an action film gets to Raiders in terms of my enjoyment, my investment, and just the overall, the magical feel that it has. It's the second best action film really for me, pretty much. There's a couple that are close, but yes, I think this is miles better than Temple of Doom in my opinion, and a return, to roughly the quality and the standards of Raiders. I do think Raiders edges it out in pretty much every department, but not like knocking it out of the park in every sense, because this does so many different things. It has been called a retread. I don't agree with that. All three of them are very different. Temple of Doom is certainly very different to Raiders. You can call it what you want, but not rip off. This one it's the same. I think it's very different. It feels kind of, it's a different flavour. Of course, it does so many different things. The Raiders doesn't attempt to do. It's just the way it is. Of course, Sean Connery is introduced in the film as the father, Henry Jones, of course. Senior, and yes, of course, this is one of the things that people kind of distinguish the film as. It's kind of the father-son relationship, and yes, of course, you also have River Phoenix, who's, it's such a tragedy what happened with him. Was a great actor, and he was great in so many things. Stand By Me as well, but he plays Indiana Jones as kind of a 13-year-old in our opening sequence, and this is some of the things it does completely differently. It kind of it's a bigger scope in many ways. It tries to broaden the kind of character, the development, and the overall, the family, all the kind of exposition there. Of course, it brings out a different side to Indiana Jones as well. So Temple of Doom kind of done this a little bit. It was a prequel, and it did definitely have a progression to his character, despite what some say. I do think it does. But this one, once again, Spielberg kind of wanted to bring out something different, and of course, Sean Connery, what we will say here, is the fact that this is James Bond, for me, the original and the best Bond, by far, in my opinion. Just legendary, this actor. He's one of my 20 favourite actors. So is Harrison Ford. In this film, just how big this is. You've got the two, for me, greatest action heroes, technically. You've got James Bond, for me, is pretty much the second best action hero, and you've got the best, kind of take on this through Sean Connery, of course, for me. And you've got them in the same film as father-son, and of course, James Bond is basically kind of the father of Indiana Jones because it was born from this. The whole kind of concepts and stuff, a combination, of course, of many things. But of course, it was inspired by James Bond in Indiana Jones, and it's just so perfect and so kind of a dream come true that you've got Sean Connery playing the father, and just on paper that is something else. When it gets to the screen, the execution is flawless in my opinion. For me, once again, like Raiders, this is cinematic perfection and one of the very, very pinnacles for me of cinema. This is just unbelievable. This film, it's a mind-blowing film. It brings back the magical feeling of Raiders, the storytelling for me, the character development, all these things, and just the overall, these set pieces, the variety and the overall progression of this narrative is just so masterful. It's something else. These characters, you've got Salah, of course, John Rhys-Davies, you've got Denholm Elliott as well, coming back as Marcus Brody. This time, even more screen time than you got in Raiders. Great character. They do many different things with the characters in this film. Some have criticised, the kind of the way they make them comedy relief. But I do think, I love, these characters in the film. I don't criticise that. I think it's brilliant what they've done, of course. And yes, what they were doing with Sean Connery in this film as the father, of course, also Henry Jones. It's just so good. This is something that could. It's just perfect in my eyes. What they've done with the dynamics, of course, of the two, and just the way it's so warm and charming. This is just as charming as it gets, really. Just like Raiders, this is just literally one of the most fun films ever made, and I do think it is a perfect film. And this relationship, father-son, is just one of the things that makes this film so legendary, so enjoyable, and it's perfect. They attempted, of course, to kind of make him, the father, of course, kind of just as good, and just as compelling and just as kind of tough and stuff as, of course, our hero. But yes, they do inject so much comedy into the film, and people do criticise that, I think, which, yeah, everyone has different opinions, but I personally think it works perfectly. The comedy in this film is some of my favourites, some of my favourite moments. Comedy moments in cinema involve just the banter between the two characters. And when the four of them, Salah and, of course, Marcus Brody, when they're all together, this is just some of my favourite moments in cinema, of course. And yes, the basic plot, is set in 1938, after you've got the time jump, with River Phoenix portrayal, which, as I say, is just perfect. The mannerisms, everything in that, performance there is so good. Such a great job River Phoenix done with this, and just a perfect pick. It's just something that the casting is so well thought out. It just could not. This is not just kind of course, Spielberg and that kind of getting so hyped and everything and thinking Sean Connery because James Bond. This is something that works so perfectly, and they made sure it worked. In every sense, every performance is perfect in my eyes, and River Phoenix, no exception there. It's just such a brilliant opening, and then of course, yeah, it leads on the transition. One of the most epic kind of cuts in film is the transition between a young and adult Indy. This is so good. Of course, takes us to 1938, and then of course we have basically the search for the Holy Grail, that kind of driven through the Indiana Jones, of course, searching for his father who's gone missing. Involving the Holy Grail, and this is the basic plot. Once again, the Nazis are back. These are the enemies of the film, and of course, this is a spoilers review. So yes. Of course, we have another love interest, although very, very different. And this is the thing: the film flips many different things. Of the previous two, you haven't got kind of a love interest. Where Indiana Jones ends up with this this person in the end. You've got of course she turns, as we know, revealed of course as one of the villains. Although very, very complex, and something that actually I felt really sorry for this character in the end, and I did. She was very, very complex. I think Alison Doody gave a great, great performance. I think people have criticised that character, but I do love that character, and I think actually very, very fleshed out, just like Raiders. I can't say Temple of Doom had complex villains at all. It didn't, but that's not a flaw for me. It's just, when compared to these two films, I think it's just everything in these two are richer. They're more, sophisticated. Also being more fun, more entertaining. The cinematography, the editing, once again, is top notch. This is something else. This is just one of the best shot films, all the way to the final, shot, which is just absolutely breathtaking. You've got the ending, which we'll get to, but it's my favourite, in the Indiana Jones franchise, and my second favourite Spielberg ending, just behind E.T. And yes, you've just got one of the most adventurous films. I think every single act in this film is absolutely masterful. You've got this drive to the film. You've got, of course, the build up at the beginning. You learn more as a kid, and stuff about Indiana Jones, and it's such a magical sequence, that kind of sequence. You learn how he's kind of scared of snakes, which is just a great moment. And of course, that whole kind of train sequence. This is stuff of legends. This is how you open a film. Once again, kind of just that, I can understand how some people would like it as much or more. As a Raiders opening, it's just absolutely something else. The way, of course, that he shot this, Spielberg, with such kind of visceral feeling. Once again, this feels like you're actually in the action, and it's so energetic, and so kind of flowing wonderfully. This is epic, and of course, just the flow for me is never broken in this film at all. And of course, like Raiders, it's more globetrotting. It's more of an adventurous variety to the adventure than Temple of Doom, which is fine with Temple of Doom. What it's doing is more kind of one location for most of the film. But these two films, I prefer this. Where it's kind of globetrotting, and the variety to the kind of set pieces. This is just off the charts, and you've got so many, some of the greatest action scenes of all time. But the opening even is stuff of legends. This is just genius stuff. It's visceral, it's thrilling, and it has such a charm and a magic to it. Of course, how he gets the hat, how he wears his signature hat. This is all born. This is brought to the screen perfectly in my eyes. Of course, Spielberg was one of the masters of kind of storyboarding his films, and this I've seen bits and stuff of that. And the Raiders storyboarding. He was just genius, with these films in particular, and I just love how this is brought to the screen, and it's just visual mastery in my opinion. And you've got the kind of the emotion to this film as well. Actually, very very emotional undercurrent. You've got the spiritual nature it taps into with the Holy Grail, and just the whole kind of kind of heartfelt father-son relationship. Of course, you learn that the two of them have not really spoken too much for many many years, and it's something that by the end of the film they're kind of rekindled their relationship, and it's just a magical kind of narrative. It's so pleasing. This is just it's something that it comes in some ways kind of as I say on the level to Raiders. I think this is a flawless film, but of course people will be expecting in this review to kind of say why I prefer Raiders and what I do prefer about it. I think in Raiders, it's very kind of it's hard to explain, but I think, well, first of all, hands down, the action is better. I think for me it's a no-brainer. Although stunning action in this, Raiders has the best action really across a film of all time for me, and just the way it's shot, the way the music is used in the action, the editing, it's all this kind of breathtaking stuff. It feels more kind of visceral. It feels like it's actually happening. And yes, just the kind of the progression to the action, and the way that in every single action scene in Raiders, it's wowing beyond anything. This isn't quite on that level, in terms of the action. I think the action in Raiders is by far the best, pretty much of anything I've ever seen. As I say, it's the greatest action film ever made, in my opinion. And I do think the energy and the level of just the flow of the film of Raiders, the energy, the magic, it's just beyond this for me personally. I can understand if people prefer this. For me, Raiders just has the kind of the legendary feel, the sense of wonder, the fantastical feel. Although you could say this leans even more towards fantasy, I think Raiders is really more of a pure representation, a finer representation of fantasy, and as I say, action adventure. Of course, just the storytelling for me, and the investment in the actual, the Ark of the Covenant, which of course is referenced in this wonderfully, and the overall, the way the music is used, everything, the sense of wonder to that film is all, for me, just it tops this, not, by miles and miles as well. the final thing, the nail in the coffin there for Raiders to be the best is the romance in the film. Of course, I would take that romance, I would take that relationship, which is one of my top 10 romances in cinema, just over really any of the relationships in this, even the father-son relationship. I think the combination, as I say, of everything in Raiders, for me, just tops Last Crusade, and just what I prefer in this is the kind of way it broadens and kind of expands on the actual the character in terms of his family, of course. The father of Sean Connery, in addition of him, is really something that I do love to bits. I think, which it kind of is a thing that I could say it does more that Raiders doesn't do. But again, it's very, very different. Raiders isn't trying to do that. What Raiders does is just deliver the greatest action adventure and one of the very best romances. And just the feel, as I say, the constant thrills, the level of kind of full body shivers that I get, of course, from Raiders. It's just a bit above this, and combination of everything. The kind of all the elements, as I say, the fantasy, the action, the non-stop, the editing, the way it's edited, the energy of the film, and the magic of this romance. Another thing as well is I just prefer a little bit, the way Indiana Jones is portrayed in Raiders. While they do, increase the scope of the film and his actual character exposition, I think the way he's portrayed, for example, the way it's revealed in Raiders, the way, the submarine scene, for example, where everyone, in the background is cheering Indiana Jones, of course, on, and just the way he's portrayed as this legendary character is just a bit finer for me in Raiders. It's just a bit more kind of legendary, something that I'm just escaping to and believing in just a bit more personally, of course, and just the level that it fills me out. It's just higher. So pretty much every way I prefer Raiders, although this has got some things that Raiders doesn't do, and I think I can understand how some people would prefer this. It comes pretty close, as close as a sequel ever would come to Raiders, of course. And in terms of final installments in a trilogy, this is either my third or second favourite, of course. And in a true trilogy like this, for example, one like Star Wars, this is literally the second best for me, final installment. This is absolutely legendary. And yes, it's just the film I cared about so much. You've got this warmth, as I say, this charm to these characters. You've got the kind of the perfect action non-stop, and of course the first 45 minutes it's just perfection. Then it gets better, of course, when Sean Connery comes into the film, and the kind of tone shifts a little bit, but not abruptly at all. It becomes more of a comedy, and of course smartly and geniusly, really, they injected the comedy into these characters. And Sean Connery, for me in this film, while he is the best Bond, the greatest Bond of all time for me, just in terms of his peak performances as James Bond, I think for me, not only did they kind of match the character here for his James Bond performances, I think actually this is the greatest and my favourite Sean Connery performance of all time, and that is something else to say that they really topped it, I think, with his character here, and just so magical, this relationship. But the performance by Sean Connery is absolutely brilliant, just absolutely legendary in this film. He is just hilarious, and it never goes too far. I know some have criticised, of course, the kind of the comedy in this film, but I love the comedy. I think it's it's perfectly portrayed, this character, and all the comedy they put into it. It just works perfectly every time. This is hilarious after that kind of first act. Just after that first 45 minutes, as I say, so much comedy here that's injected, and it just works so well. This makes the dynamics, of course, the back and forth between Harrison Ford and Sean Connery, of course, just makes for some of the most satisfying and enjoyable moments in cinema. And I love the kind of the balance between the comedy, of course, and the drama, which kind of you wouldn't expect, from this film, really, but it does actually go very, very deep, while being very funny, of course, very, very deep into this kind of relationship, father-son, and of course, as I say, by the end, you're completely, it's just a complete narrative. It brings everything together really spiritually and everything. The whole trilogy does. This is something that this whole trilogy for me it doesn't get more fun really than this, rarely anyway, than this. This is just the collection of this, is some of the most fun films in cinema, and for me, in terms of Raiders and The Last Crusade, quality as well. This is just complete genius, mastery of all the elements, and yes, as I say, the action tops itself again and again, and you get to that final act, which just before the final kind of sequence, the tank scene is just absolutely so thrilling. It's just something else, and stuff of legends. The kind of the variety there, the comedy injected, as I say, to all of this action is so genius. But then of course you've got the very very spiritual ending, of the Holy Grail, and I did feel a lot for these the villains. Temple of Doom, as I say, it doesn't have complex villains. It doesn't attempt to do this at all. But it's not. It doesn't bother me. It's just I would take Raiders and Last Crusade. They are better in every single way for me than Temple of Doom. They do the things that Spielberg's best at, so much, and that is create a sense of wonder, and they do bring more of a kind of a level of emotion to the way the films are made. This film, has such a heart, just like Raiders, and I do personally prefer Raiders, but I think this, as I say, is pretty much the closest an action film for my enjoyment as ever got, and just a perfect film. This is my third favourite Spielberg, or fourth. I'm not going to reveal. There's two very very close ones. This and another film, but apart from that, and Indiana Jones. Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. This is my favourite really. This is one of the ones that is in my top 30 and just exceeds, pretty much anything I've ever seen. Just genius visual storytelling. Some of the most thrilling set pieces of all time. This is where they expand on this character. Not that they needed to. Raiders was perfect in a sense of wonder. And the stuff, you had exposition where they didn't really show different characters. But this one does actually go. It tries so hard, of course, to expand on this kind of this character and the universe to this, and it does it perfectly. Spielberg, of course, at the top of his game. This is something absolutely mesmerising in every sense, and the sense of wonder, the thrills to this, the perfect balance of comedy and action, and of course drama. Makes for one of the greatest films of all time. And you've got the extra special, kind of checklist here, the tick box for me, which is an ending, where some don't like these endings, but I personally do. When a character or someone just goes off, walks off into the sunset. In this film, you have all four of these characters riding off, into the sunset. This does not get more pleasing. This is absolutely epic, and I just love this ending, and it's something that I look for in films sometimes. It's just, the ending to an action film or something, and it double ticks the box. It's literally one of my very, very favourite endings of all time. Just behind, E.T. in terms of Spielberg endings. And just the level of camaraderie, between these four characters, as I say, it's just off the charts. It rarely gets more enjoyable, a combination of characters and ensemble, cast to this film. It's something where every single character works perfectly in harmony with the other characters, and in particular this team of four characters, old friends and kind of family. It's just so enjoyable. The level of charm and just the banter between them. Wow, this is just, it's literally made as a pleaser. This is like a dream come true. For someone who loves Raiders of the Lost Ark, and something that will never ever, I've never seen. It's just something that is so unique, and something that I would take over literally pretty much any film, ever. As I say, just like Raiders, very very close, if not in the top 10 mark, pretty much. Just something that I truly adore in every sense, and these characters, the kind of the charm, the magic. This is movie magic, and these characters. One of the many reasons, of course, but the biggest reason for me, why I love these films, this trilogy, but in this film in particular, of course, and Raiders, it's such a combination, of so much, warmth, of course, the charm, and in this film, as I say, these characters just make for one of the most memorable and unforgettable, kind of pleasing, films of all time, and as I say. Just perfect in the way they handle these characters for me personally. I love the interpretations, and the way they kind of make Marcus more kind of more funny in the film and upbeat. I just love this. I love Salah again, and yeah, just four characters who are perfect together, on screen. This film is very, very close, in some ways to Raiders. I think Raiders takes the cake. Hands down for me, I do prefer that. But again, this is basically an extension of Raiders. Not as good. I don't like it as much, but it is kind of part of the same thing. When I do my favorite films list, this is what I do with some franchises like The Godfather, or trilogies, and kind of Star Wars trilogy, the originals. Some of the placements I have are kind of joint, so Temple of Doom, because it's nowhere close to these two films in the trilogy, it's a separate placement, outside my top 100, but this film has actually got a joint placement with Raiders, but I do, I will be putting kind of so-and-so, the number A and then B, so this of course will be, something B, that's what I would say there, but of course I do prefer Raiders, but it's part of the same thing, because it does so much to enrich this experience. It's just another, way to complete this whole universe, and it works in perfect harmony with Raiders, and you've got the way that they both enhance each other kind of thing, and yes, this film is absolutely perfect in every sense. There is nothing to flaw in my opinion. Once again, this is just, it's so thrilling. The shivers I get from this, the action is just, so epic. And of course, once again, energy drinks to make me, even more on edge, and kind of get the full experience, of all the action. It's just a visual treat, this film, and it's so thrilling. The level of tension, of course, and the comedy. All the villains are so great, and this is a film that's just so invested in from start to finish. This is a magnum opus for me, and of course, it gets full marks, no doubt. This is very, very hard to top. Pretty much impossible. My favourites to top, well into my top 30, and as I say, a joint placement on my all-time favourite films list. Of course, when I do my Spielberg ranking, I'm pretty sure I'll be saying, doing them separate ranking, this and Raiders. But as I say, this is one of my very, very favourite Spielbergs, and just pretty much my second favourite action film of all time. This is just as satisfying as it gets, really. Pretty much, this is the perfect way to end a masterful trilogy, in my opinion. The greatest, pure action trilogy of all time, and just, never ever, will you see a pairing like, of course, Harrison Ford and Sean Connery in this way. What this means, and just, because if you, as I say, if you look at this on paper, it is just, it's a dream film, and you'd think, if you'd not seen the film but you read about it, kind of, wow, that has the potential, to be something truly special. And luckily, really exceeded what it was on paper, and what this is a dream film for me. A legendary final act to this trilogy, which I think is pretty much perfect. A couple of imperfections in Temple of Doom, but they all get full marks. Like Raiders, this gets 100% plus, tier S, my highest rating that I ever give to films, and it's a no-brainer for me. This is one of the most mind-blowing films of all time, not just for its action adventure, but of course for the level, the characters, are some of the best in film. Of course, there is always kind of a debate, what is the best Harrison Ford character in cinema? There's kind of polls and stuff with Han Solo and Indiana Jones. Well, as I've said in Raiders, I think, this is the best character that he plays. And I do hands down think, in Last Crusade especially, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, I think this character and this performance is the finest, of Harrison Ford's kind of involvement. I do think it trumps Han Solo, personally. I understand, people think otherwise, but for me, this is the finest, Harrison Ford performance, along with Raiders, and this is what I think of when I think of Harrison Ford. This is just his character, the one that, of course, defines all, and of course, the greatest action hero for me of all time. But again, kind of paired, as a father in the film, with the second best action hero of all time, which is James Bond, Sean Connery, and it's just so genius how they done this, and of course brought him into the film. This is legendary. This is one of the very best films of all time for me. The level of charm, of wonder once again, bringing back that feel of Raiders in many ways, but not quite on the level, but the sense of wonder. The sophistication, the way, all these ideas, fantasy ideas are brought to the table. So it's so believable. Even though it's kind of a comedy, action and stuff. The fantasy levels, all the elements in this film are so believable. In terms of just I'm fully invested in this. And just in awe of of this as the characters are on the screen. So am I, of course, and just every act is just perfect. It's constantly so involving. Every frame is shot perfectly, in my opinion, and just again, kind of the variety and the kind of wonderful locations that Raiders has. And yes, for me, just emotionally, in terms of how thrilling it is, the feel-good nature of the film, and of course the scope, what they do when they add in young Indiana Jones with River Phoenix, and then of course you have the father in the film, played by Sean Connery, perfectly in his finest, in my opinion, finest role, finest character, and yes, just it is perfect. It is the perfect way to end, this trilogy, this legendary trilogy. Rounding off, of course, pretty much, the 80s Spielberg's films, and of course, for me, his finest decade, and yeah, just truly something else. I absolutely adore this film, and it trumps, as I say, pretty much any film. It's been once again a wonderful joy to rewatch these films, and just I look forward to doing it again next year. It's a trilogy that I do try and watch, roughly every year or two, and rewatching films, of course, when you know what a film's like and you love a film so much, and a trilogy, a trilogy where you love all the films, it's very, very rare, to get a trilogy for me, this consistent. It's definitely my top 5 trilogies overall. Probably my third or fourth, favorite trilogy, definitely. Or no, I'd definitely say yes, at least my third favorite trilogy, and number one is definitely my number one trilogy. But this is not far off, by the numbers, and just the way this is a trilogy I can look forward to in every sense. This is just great. This is everything I want, from a final act in the trilogy, and it's perfect in every way. The performances, the way the characters are written, every way the characters built up. Sean Connery, where he's not fully seen at first until around about the 45-minute mark, and it is perfect. The way the characters are built up, the way the plot, it's kind of got this mystery once again. The feel that Raiders had, not quite on the level, but again, it's something that the return to this. I love the return to the kind of good old, action adventure film that Raiders is, and Temple of Doom is very, very different again, but this is a return to this, and just something that is classic, that I just love. Good old traditional kind of action adventure films, feel good, and just so much fun. And you've got the mystery, you've got the awe, you've got the fantasy in there. Stuff that I can fully believe in. It's just perfect escapism in my eyes. And one of these films, it just represents for me what cinema is above all, and that is just Spielberg really once again delivering one of the pinnacles of cinema, in my opinion. And yes, tell me your thoughts in the comments. And of course, more Spielberg reviews coming. We're running out of the very, very best ones fairly soon. We've got a few left, but probably not more than 5 left. That are some of his very best. Of course, I've got a couple coming soon that I'm not a true passionate fan about. But yes, this trilogy I adore. This is one of the most cherished kind of films that I have, and just one of the pinnacles for me of cinema. This film and Raiders as well. This is stuff of legends, and tell me your thoughts in the comments. What you prefer, why you don't prefer this to some, one of the other ones, and how you'd rank the trilogy or Spielberg films. Be interested to see. Of course, I'll be doing the ranking eventually, but yes, this film is one of my very, very favourites for many, many reasons that I've explained in this review. So yes, thanks for watching my review.